Also, I'll mention this. Harris Secret has the best holiday buffets there are. We were there for Thanksgiving, and we have a reservation for Christmas. And the reason that I like them is the buffets aren't cheap, but they include all of the lobster you want to eat.
Hello, and welcome to the Manifesto with Gideon, the Free-quent Flyer on the Milenomics Podcast Network. I am Gideon, the Free-quent Flyer, and I'm joined today by Ted Fleischaker, board member of Portland, Maine's Chaim Synagogue and publisher of the Portland newspaper. Ted, welcome to the Manifesto.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Here on the Manifesto, we get our plugs in up top. So is there anything that you want people to know, anywhere people can find you online or in real life?
Well, they can find me two places online. Let's start there. They can find our synagogue, which is what we're talking about for one thing today, by going to etzchaim-portland.org, or they can find my newspaper, and they can read the whole paper online, but we also have what I call the Dead Tree Edition, which is print, and we can be found at www.upportland.com, and you need both P's in there, so it's upportland.com altogether. And you can also find me running around in the Old Port, which is downtown Portland, because I live down here, and I frequent all of the shops from Makuchi's grocery store to some of the bookshops, and you'll find me running around, usually dressed in something weird. I'm known for some of my outlandish jackets, and I've got a hat that makes me look like a pineapple. So I've got all kind of weird things I wear.
I love it. So we met each other in the actually, probably better for you to describe it. Was it in the synagogue or in the shul or in the building of the Chaim facility?
It's all the same thing, because the museum and the synagogue occupy the building together at the corner of India and Congress Streets in Portland. And I work as a docent up there a couple of days a week when I don't have anything better to do. And Up Portland being a monthly newspaper, I find that I quite often have an afternoon or a little time to spare. I'm generally up there on Monday in the evening, and I'm up there on Sunday afternoons, but I attend services quite often on Saturday, and we have some Torah studies and all kind of things we do. But you caught me up there when I was doing some of my docent work, and I take deep pride in showing people our building and telling them about the synagogue.
Yeah, so you were telling us about some pretty serious renovations that had taken place that had closed the synagogue for quite a while. Is that right? Yep.
We were already closed for COVID a year ago in March, and 2 months later, a fire broke out behind the ark up on the main sanctuary floor and burnt up one wall and damaged the ark, the Torahs, as well as the stained glass window that is behind there. The resulting sprinklers and the full blast fire department hoses for an hour caused part of the floor to collapse and a lot of damage. And when the city came in to talk to us about what we needed to do to get a permit to reopen, they were kind of like, oh, we never really realized the fact that you still have wiring that's original to this building, and that would be wiring dating to 1921. So essentially we had to pull every wire out of the building, top to bottom, have it all rewired, have light fixtures rewired or replaced, and some of both. And at the end of the day, I think the elevator, which was just a year old, was about the only wiring that got to stay. Everything else, from the lamp in the rabbi's office to the chandeliers that are in the main sanctuary, had to either be rewired or replaced.
And you mentioned that the women's section of the synagogue had been closed or relocated during that period, or?
Oh, that's actually before. I mean, just to give you just a quick history, the building was actually not built as a synagogue. It was built in the 1880s as part of a rebuild that was done of that entire area of Portland. A lot of people outside this area don't know it, but the city virtually burned to the ground on the 4th of July of 1866. They were having a big celebration of the one-year anniversary of the end of the Civil War, a young man's firework landed in a bale of hay, and it was a windy, dry summer's day, and it burnt all the way up through downtown, through the area that we these days call the Old Port. And at the end of the day, we lost about 50 to 60 or more percent of the buildings that were existing in Portland. When it was over, there were huge swathes of ruins and vacant ground because most of the old buildings had been wood. So starting in the late 1860s and then going beyond, they slowly replaced the buildings. The building that replaced the burnt down one at our location actually was not a synagogue at all, but it was a boarding house. We're located on the side of Munjoy Hill, which is literally a hill, not a mountain. And the top had a huge Jewish community, so much so that it was known as Munju Hill. The bottom of the hill, which is roughly where I happen to live now, was a huge Italian community, and the Macucci Italian Grocery, which has been in the same building since 1931, still exists right across the street from my house. And in between was a immigrant community, a lot of Irish especially. And the boarding house that they were living in is the building that in 1921 became our synagogue. How it became that is kind of interesting. There's a synagogue built in 1904 down the block. It's just off India Street on Newbury Street, and that would be Sherry Tefillah Synagogue. And they had a fight in the early 1920s over whether they should keep the services and everything in that language they had used called Yiddish, or to switch to that modern language called English. Things got so acrimonious at one point, from the history we've read, the rabbi's chair was taken from the pulpit and placed in the bathroom to show contempt. And anyway, when it all settled down, the English group lost. So a bunch of them came up, spent around $50,1921 remodeling the building, which they had already purchased, and turned the building into what you saw when you got there. There were a few things that had been added along the way, but the building has an interesting history after that, because what happened was after World War II, a lot of the Jews in this part of town decided to either not come back to Maine at all, you know, the old thing about after you've seen the rest of the world, and they left Portland and Maine, and the ones that did come back wanted to live in modern areas of what I would call the suburbs. So when things were all finished, said and done, the congregation, which started in 1921 with around 290 members, at one point got down to under 100. So the balcony, which had been where the women sat, because the women and men in Orthodox synagogues do not sit together, was filled in with a false ceiling, and the front window, which is a beautiful stained glass, was bricked in from the outside, and they didn't therefore have to heat the top part of the building. They put a border down the middle of the main floor, and one side was the men's side and one was the women's side. They kept decreasing, though, in population over and over until sometime in the mid to late 1970s. There were only about 15 members left. So there was a big debate on what to do. They could either sell the building and would ultimately have been torn down and something built in its place, or they could hang on, or they could merge with another congregation. And the congregations in that area, at one point there were 5 of them within a few blocks. Most of them are gone. In fact, they all are now. Sherry Tefillah moved to the suburbs and ultimately went away. Adas Israel, that's gone. Anchi Sfard, there's a parking lot there now. So what ended up happening was so many of these old historic synagogues vanished. It was decided that ours was worthy of preserving, so it became a museum, and a museum foundation was established. They took over the building. The congregation, for a couple of dollars a year, rents the building back. So we still have services. We still have a rabbi. We still have all of the things that a Jewish congregation has. But the building also houses several art galleries, one on the first floor and one on the third. And the building also is leased out for different events. So For example, the Ponte String Quartet plays their Portland season in our building because we have wonderful acoustics in our main sanctuary. Our fence on the front of the gate on the front of the pulpit is designed so that it can be lifted up and taken out, and that allows for things to be put up there that are part of those rental shows. So, for example, the Bach Society a few weeks ago brought a whole harpsichord in and put it up there and did Bach harpsichord concerti. And if you went to services the week after, you would never have known. It was brought in, used, taken out, and the gate put back up. So it's designed to allow things like that. The congregation, however, was still having problems through the 70s, 80s, and 90s until it was decided that they would become no longer Orthodox but egalitarian. We have some gay members, some straight members, some black members, some white members, some mixed families where one spouse might be Christian and one Jewish, combination of you name it. As a result of all of that, it's wonderful because our population has grown. We now have 300 families on our rolls. We have 3 services a week at the synagogue. We have one on Monday evening that's a very short Orthodox minyan, we call it. We have a Friday night Reform, very liberal Friday evening service. It's just about 45 minutes at 6 o'clock. And then on Saturday morning, we have a 2-hour Orthodox, but not fanatically so, service where we get out one of the Torahs and read it, and we do all of the ceremonial things that are part of a Jewish service. So we have a little bit of everything, but because everybody is welcome, all of a sudden families and single people and everybody is finding us again, and our rentals of the building, as well as the art that are in the galleries that we have in there selling, mean that we don't have to have any dues. You know, most congregations have dues that people have to pay. We don't have any. So you can be a member for free, which a lot of people find very, very much to their liking.
Ted, let me interrupt you just to ask a lot of questions that my listeners right now are definitely asking themselves. So you've explained a little bit about the history of the congregations in the 20th century, but what is the origin of the Jewish community in Maine in the way that people know about the Irish famine driving Irish immigrants to New York, or Puerto Ricans to their own communities in New York? Is there a story behind why Maine has such a strong Jewish community?
Well, the Jewish community here started and stopped and then restarted. There was record of a congregation as early as the 1830s in Bangor, which is the second largest city in Maine, and it's about 120 miles north of Portland in the middle of the state. The Bangor congregation disappeared very suddenly around 1840s, and nobody actually knows for 100% sure why. The supposition has always been, and that I've always heard and I've always read, is because there was a banker in Bangor, say that fast, who was anti-Semitic, and he declined to give loans and work with the Jewish community there. And that meant the community had to go elsewhere. So the congregation that was there in Bangor folded, and those people moved elsewhere, not to Portland, but nobody really knows where. It went away. So for a few years, there really wasn't much in the way of congregational life here. It came back after the Civil War and went from there. But the answer to your question is it mostly was European Jews, both Eastern and Western European. So we're talking about places like Slovakia, Poland, as well as Germany, Spain, France. But the ones that started at Chaim were Eastern European. So that would mean Poland and that area of Europe. That's why we have a rather unique design with our pulpit in 2 parts.
Ted, what's the significance of that, having the pulpit in 2 parts?
Well, it's there because the Torah had its own pulpit, and the Torah still does at our congregation. But to read the Torah, you have to take it to the reading table, which is on the other pulpit. So you actually take the Torah out of the ark, you say the blessings, and you march around the synagogue as it's done while you chant the blessings. And then when you're finished with that, you go to the reading table, which is on the other pulpit, open the Torah and read it. So it's two different pieces, but they're not connected. If you go to a Reform or most conservative congregations, they have one central pulpit that does both things. We don't.
Let me ask you, before we finish up on the Jewish community in Maine, I wanted to ask you what Jewish traditions look like today in Portland or in Bangor or in Maine. If somebody is in Maine for the High Holy Days, what should they look for? What should they expect?
Well, at present, we have 8,000 Jews in what we call Southwest Maine. That's this area that we live in. That's Portland. That's Lewiston, Auburn, the county just south of us, which is York County. And the Jewish community here is very vibrant. Portland has 4 synagogues, a Chabad house, a Reform synagogue, Beth Ham. We have a conservative synagogue, and that's Temple Bethel. And we have our synagogue, that's Chaim. If you go just a few miles in any direction, you will find a small town or city that does have its own synagogue. So there is one in Lewiston. There's one just south of here in Old Orchard Beach. There's another one in Biddeford and Saco. And then there's a very cool one that I find very cool in Bath, Maine, which is north of here, about 35 miles. They all are served in various ways by various clergy. So, for example, we have a full-time rabbi. The other synagogues here in Portland have full-time rabbis. If you go up to Bath, they share a rabbi with Waterville, which is up on the other side. So there's various things that are done in different ways to make all the ends meet. But the synagogues here in Maine are very, very, very active. And we have a Center for Small Town Jewish Life, which is based in Waterville. And they do some really interesting classes and studies about Judaism in small towns, which Maine is full of. I mean, everybody thinks Portland might be a big city. Our metro area is close to 500,000 people, but the city only's got 67,000 people. So it's not very big at all. Not at all.
I wanted to ask you, just because it happened while we happened to be in town and met you, that your full-time rabbi had a COVID case.
He did indeed. He did. He got COVID, and it was a mild case, but of course it kept him off the pulpit for the better part of 3 weeks. And we muddled through. The services continued all the way through the whole pandemic because we went on Zoom pretty quickly. And even to this day, most services are both on Zoom and in person. Rabbi likes to have a minyan, which is 10 people. We count women and men, but 10 people at the service before he'll do certain prayers. So like last Saturday morning, there were 14 of us sitting in the synagogue, and there was 4 on Zoom. Total 18 people attended. But last Friday night, there was 1 person in the sanctuary, and there were 9 people on Zoom. 10 people, that's a minyan, not counting the rabbi, which made 11. But so we do that. But the rabbi was very cautious. He actually did a bar mitzvah the weekend before he was diagnosed. He let the family know that he was not feeling his best and that he was getting a test again. He had one that came back negative, so they took a chance, and he did the service, and then 2 days later was diagnosed. As far as he knows and we know, no, it wasn't spread, and no one else came down with it from him being sick. It's never a good idea to be sick, but he handled it really, really well. And as far as I know, we have had very few other cases. We do wear our masks in the sanctuary. We're even doing the small services upstairs in the main hall because the main hall is larger, and the main hall has got the ability for us to be able to be very socially distanced. We can fit 300 people in up there. So if we have 14 people for services, as you can imagine, We can stay very, 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 very far apart and still hear and take part. So we try really, really hard, as best we can. We try really hard to be able to continue to have services each week. And the people who either are afraid to come because they're worried about they're worried about COVID, or they're worried about something going on, whatever, all of those people can attend online, and they can still be part of the service. So we try to include everyone in all of our events.
That's fantastic. So moving on, you're also the publisher of the Up Portland newspaper about Portland, Maine. And one of the things that was most striking to me while we were visiting is just how many local newspapers there were. It seemed like every island had its own newspaper, and there were individualized subject matter papers about the lobster boat races and things like that. So I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you how Portland, Maine, or Maine in general, supports so many newspapers with so many diverse subject matters.
The big thing I found when I moved here, which was only 6.5 years ago, is that people up here still read. Maine has the oldest population in the entire country, even older than Florida. They're number 2 behind us. Because our population tends to be older, a lot of us old folks enjoy reading on paper. I will confess, I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and even the Times of London on my computer. But I get 3 newspapers delivered to my door every morning. And you can get all of the New York papers, the Boston papers, and, of course, local papers. All of them are available on newsstand or at the door if you happen to subscribe. So that means that we have a really unique situation, whereas most people struggle to get a shadow of a newspaper, because I moved here from Indianapolis, and Gannett owns the Indianapolis Star. It's a shadow of the paper that was there when I moved there 25 years before. There's just a very few pages. There's very little news. There's very little anything in there because it's just less and less and less space. Because the advertisers are not supporting it. Here in Maine, we still have very good advertiser support.
What does that advertiser support look like? Is that local listings for obituaries or announcements of foreclosure sales? What does that advertising structure look like?
It's a little bit of everything. We don't carry obituaries in mine, so we're just a monthly paper. We call ourselves the downtown newspaper or the peninsula newspaper because downtown, the middle of the city here, is on a peninsula sticking into Casco Bay. So consequently, we try to keep our area limited. I think the papers that are out here, I'll try to keep their areas limited, but many of the papers have the same owner. And I won't lie to you, COVID has been tough on some papers. I've been very lucky. We basically have come out unaffected. I'm running no less advertising right now than I was before COVID hit, which is very fortunate. But like, for example, there was a paper that served the northern suburbs here, places like Falmouth and Yarmouth and that area up there, the northern suburbs of the city. And it was called The Notes. And The Notes did not make it out of the backside of COVID. The Notes is out of business. A lot of papers combined with each other or combined elsewhere. And the company that owns the Press Herald, which is the daily here, Maine Today Media, they own a lot of the newspapers in the state. But they, again, have a local owner here in Maine. They're not owned by some conglomerate out of Chicago or New York or Los Angeles. They're local. And the biggest thing that I think is a plus for us here in Maine, and I don't want to be rude about it, but I'll be honest about it. And that is, we don't have a single Gannett paper here in the state of Maine. As you know, Gannett is, the biggest newspaper company that exists. And the problem with Gannett is that whenever you have a big outside corporation trying to run the show on anything, doesn't really matter what the hell it is, you end up with that corporation's executive offices making a decision. Well, Gannett, last I looked, I think they moved, but they were based in Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. Well, if you were going to get anything through Gannett, it had to come through, where else? The home office. If the home office didn't like what you were doing, they would either change it or they wouldn't buy your paper and you'd go broke. So many of the papers in cities that I know well are not the papers they used to be. The best example is Gannett now owns the Louisville Courier-Journal. They own the Indianapolis Star, the Cincinnati Enquirer, as well as the Nashville Tennessean, and the Evansville Courier and Press, and the Lafayette, Indiana Journal and Courier, and I could go on and on and on. But all of those are in a chunk of the Midwest, all adjacent to each other. Well, when Gannett came in and snapped them all up a few at a time and brought out families, they either cut the staffs back, so one person in Chicago, say, is laying out 5 newspapers. They don't have their own layout person in each city. So if you look at all of them, you'll see something that looks somewhat of a carbon copy and a shadow of its former self. You also have another disadvantage, and that is they cut back the amount of money they want to spend on local news gathering. So the number of reporters that are in Louisville, for example, isn't the number that were there 10 years ago when the Bingham family owned the paper. And they've turned the tap off on a lot of things that were costly and honorable, but were expensive. So, for example, I was thinking about this the other day. I can't name one city that still has an afternoon paper in the United States. London does, but New York, they have 3 morning papers. They don't have an afternoon paper anymore. A lot of the papers that used to be PMs, which I'm very fond of afternoon papers, are long gone. Those afternoon papers no longer exist.
So I wanted to ask, this is a question that I'm sure a lot of people have, since these papers in Maine are locally owned. What goes into publishing a paper, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly? Is there a literal printing press in Maine that you can submit the sheets to, and they'll run off a monthly paper for you? Do you deliver them by USPS? Do you have paper boxes on the streets? I know I picked up my copy of Up Portland at the Synagogue, but how is Up Portland written, printed, and distributed? Just tell me everything.
First of all, a lot of the printing has been centralized and is done by the Daily, the Press Herald here in Portland. They're actually South Portland is where their printing center is. So they print the Bangor paper, the Portland paper. They print a lot of the weeklies and a lot of the monthlies. Up here in Maine, they print the Brunswick paper, which is a daily. But the other thing is, you can, because New England states are small, remember, this isn't Montana, Wyoming, or Washington State where you can drive for miles and not pass a town or a person. I can drive 5 hours and pass through, 5 major cities between here and New York, and that includes Boston. So there's a lot of printing presses in different towns up here that will contract. Right now, we're printing up Portland in Concord, New Hampshire, at the Concord Monitor. When I first started it, I was printing it in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the Seacoast Media's plant down there at the Portsmouth Herald. We moved for 2 reasons. One, because the print job was not as good as what I wanted most months, and because Gannett bought the Portsmouth paper. A family still owns the Concord paper. And the word local comes to mind, and it did when you were asking the question. I think everything local works, or at least it does up here. So, who are my advertisers? Easy. For the grocery store across the street, the Italian grocery, Micucci's, where I go shop. The Pat's Meat Market, where I go in old-fashioned style. I buy meat there. They don't sell, anything weird. They sell meat, chicken, fish. No fish, just chicken and meat, because if I want fish, I go down to Harbor Fish Market. They don't sell any meat or chicken. They sell fish. They're on the dock. So if I'm going to go somewhere and buy something, they know me by name. They know me when I walk through the door. It's a small town in that respect. Downtown Portland, everybody pretty much knows everybody. So if I want donuts, I walk up to Hi-Fi Donuts and I get them. If I want fish, I go to Harbor Fish Market. Well, all of those people know me because they see me come through the door. So they also know what I do. And so if I need an advertiser for something or some special project I'm doing, I know who to call. So, like, we have the only surfing column in New England. I have a monthly surfing column. It's in Portland every month. It's written by two young men who went to Bates College here in Maine. One still lives in Maine, and the other has gone down to North Carolina to get his graduate degree in oceanography and oceanographic studies. Well, they still write the surfing column. But we needed an advertiser. So we had one from down south of us in Scarborough for a little while. And when they said they weren't going to continue because they didn't think it got them enough business, I approached Maine Surfers Union, and Charlie, who owns that, signed up, and we now have it sponsored. Why? Because I'm not a surfer. I used to try, but I never was any good at it. But I go in there because he sells a really cool selection of surfing T-shirts and mugs and all kind of fun things. And I give an awful lot of gifts at Christmas time and Hanukkah time. And so he knows me from coming in. Hi-Fi Donuts. I don't eat very many donuts, but they have an awesome chicken sandwich at lunchtime. So they know me from coming in the door. I have a newsstand downtown that distributes the papers and advertises. They know me because I walk in the door quite frequently just to get a copy of the Financial Times or the New York Times. If the people know you, they're very likely here to do business with you. And if the other side of the coin is looked at, they also are happy, even if they're not doing any business, to distribute your papers. So, for example, there's a co-op grocery store that's right across the street from the synagogue. And they know me in the co-op. I go in there quite often on Friday to pick up a challah to go with my Shabbos dinner on Friday night. So I asked them, and they said, of course. There's a rack with Up Portland right in the entrance. And we stock that rack up and keep it neat and clean. We share the rack with several other small publications. But Up Portland is in there because they know me, and they know that I come in there almost every Friday and what I buy almost every Friday. So it's all a matter of personal service. If we had if we were having to deal with a big corporation out of, South Succotash, it would be a totally different ballgame. But when we have our locals, our people right here in town that know us, and this is, when we moved here 6.5 years ago, after a couple of months, somebody back in Indiana said to me, well, how much different is it? What's it like there? And my immediate answer to them was, think Europe. And they're like, what do you mean? And I said, I could take a shopping bag. I can't take a plastic one because they're not allowed in Maine anymore. But I can take my reusable shopping bag and go walking down the street on a Friday afternoon, and I can pick up a challah to go with my dinner. I can pick up fish, lobster, meat at one of two or three places down here. I can pick up, any sort of desserts, go by Two Fat Cats Bakery and get a pie. And all of these are places that have won all sorts of awards for their food and what they do and how they do it, but they're all local. And I take that shopping bag and walk around just like you would if you were in Amsterdam or somewhere in the north of England, not in London because that's just another big city. But if you think about that, I can't think of very many towns or cities anywhere that on foot you can walk around and get all of the things that you would buy for your meal or for your day. I mean, it's all there and it's all available right on the spot, which I think is totally unique.
Yeah, that's a really great point that even places that don't advertise in the paper are still advertising the paper when they're distributing it and handing it out to create that kind of presence throughout the community.
I try really hard, and I think it's also really important because here's what I'll say. I have friends who live in all over the country and all over the world, actually. I taught for a while years ago at the University of Louisville, and one of my students now lives in Serbia. Former students. I talk to people from all over, and know people all over. My assistant actually lives in Amsterdam now, my old assistant. But the point I'm trying to make is simply this. So many of the people still don't know the people in their own hometown. If you don't know the people in your own hometown, then you can't expect any special service or treatment. But if they know who I am when I walk through the door, I don't have to ask. They know, what I'm looking for. When I walk into Two Fat Cats, they know that our favorite pie to have here is their New England bog. And New England is just a very unique microcosm of what you might see or have seen, rather, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the whole country. The downside of that, though, is there's some things that we just don't have. Like, for example, we do have a BJ's, but we don't have a Costco because Costco isn't here. When I was out in the Midwest, I like to go to the German supermarket called Aldi. There is no Aldi in Maine. The positive side of that is there are not a lot of weird, racist, crazy religious people running around here like elsewhere. So, for example, there's some total of one Hobby Lobby in Maine. They were the people that are homophobic and did all of the managing to screw around with help for people who wanted abortions, and went all the way to the Supreme Court to win their case a few years ago. A lot of people aren't here. Some that I really miss, and some that I'm really glad we don't have. I mean, they just made a big hoo-ha. We just got the first ever Chick-fil-A in Maine about a month and a half ago.
All right, Ted, I want to be solicitous of your time, so I want to get to the next section where we can just do a rapid fire question session for first-time visitors to Portland, because it was my partner and I's first visit to Portland and to Maine. So I want to get some rapid fire recommendations from you about, first, where to stay. We stayed at the Hyatt downtown. It was fine. Is there the perfect place to stay in Portland and Maine that you love more than anywhere else?
Yep, it depends what you're looking for. And I tell people this when they ask, pardon me, for restaurants and for all sorts of things, anything and everything has its own. Everybody doesn't wear the same pair of jeans. Some people like them loose. Some people like them tight. Some people roll up the bottom. Some people don't roll up the bottom.
All right, this is a rapid fire. This is a rapid fire session. You got to say where your favorite place to stay in Portland is.
My favorite place to stay in Portland would be the Eastland Hotel. The Eastland is actually a Westin now. The joke is it's the Eastland Westland. It was built in the 1920s. It is a very, very fancy, if it's a Westin, it has to be, hotel with a wonderful bar on the roof.
All right. Second, what to eat. Everyone wants the perfect lobster roll. I had 2 lobster rolls in Portland. One was absolutely magical. The second was inedible, and I threw it out. Where is the perfect lobster roll? Or whatever else the perfect dish is.
Well, I hope I'm not going to recommend the one you threw out. But my favorite is I drive across the bridge to South Portland, and I go to a place called Docks, D-O-C-K''S, Docks Seafood in South Portland at the corner of Broadway and Evans Streets. They have awesome everything. Keep in mind the fact that lobster has gone way up in price this year, because you can blame the pandemic for that. And also, if you want to know something else, there's a restaurant called Street and Company, and it is owned by a fellow whose name is Dana Street. They have an awesome lobster dinner called In the Pan. It's a copper pan with wonderful linguine in it and a garlic butter sauce, and then they take a lobster and slice it horizontally and open it up so you don't have to work to eat it, and it is absolutely wonderful.
All right, next, what to see while you are in Maine? You're in Maine for a weekend. What do you have to see?
Well, everybody has to go out to Portland Headlight, which is out in Fort Williams Park from downtown Portland. That's about a 15-minute ride. So you got to go out there and see the light. It's supposedly the most photographed lighthouse in the world. If you have time to run around Maine and go further from that, well, I recommend strongly that you go up to Bar Harbor and see Acadia, which is the only national park in Maine. And Bar Harbor is a beautiful little town. It's very seasonal, but it's neat. If you want to combine a couple of things together, a lot of people swear by the lobster rolls in season and town in season. There's a town just north of here called Wiscasset, and there's a place there called Red's Eats, and it's very famous. They have a Facebook page and tell you when they're going to open and when they're going to close, and I think they're overpriced, but it's nice, and it's a town full of neat little shops. There's one I love that sells all kind of stuff called Rock, Paper, Scissors, which is a great name for a shop too. But anyway, I like to go up to Wiscasset. I also like to go to Damariscotta. And south of here, my recommendation is please don't miss Kennebunk and Kennebunkport. They're actually two towns. They're about 2 miles apart. The port is obviously on the water, and Kennebunk is inland 2 miles. They were made famous, of course, that's where George Bush, the first George Bush, had his compound, and the buildings are still standing. His son, who was also president later, is still there sometimes in the year, and you can drive by and look, but you can't touch. And if security is out front, then you know that the former president is in residence.
So when we were deciding where to go in Maine, we were basically flipping a coin between the two airports in Portland and Bangor. So, Ted, Portland or Bangor?
Portland has much more service, especially nonstop. We have a lot of nonstop to Florida. We have nonstop now to Indianapolis, but we also have nonstop to Chicago and Detroit and some of those hubs like Baltimore, Washington, and you can make it a lot easier, and you'll find competitive fares.
All right. So during the pandemic, Ted, we've been finishing every episode with our core question of the week. Are you ready for this week's question?
Let's have it.
For folks who are thinking of taking a socially distanced winter getaway during Omicron in Maine this New Year's, what's your go-to romantic nook in the state? Whether it's an island or a isolated fireplace somewhere, or whatever means romance for you. Where should people be going this New Year's?
Well, go to Bar Harbor if you want, because the hotels give you wonderful deals and have a lot of rooms. After the leaves have fallen, which they have done because there's snow today. Or there's a few really neat little places here and there that you would probably like. There was a hotel that I stayed at opening day 5 years ago in the town of Rockland. It's wonderful. You can walk the breakwater and look out over the ocean, which this time of year is kind of a very misty, fun thing to see. And it's called the 250 Maine Hotel. Keep in mind the fact that a lot of the places I would normally recommend to you are not open in the middle of the winter because after season, between a lack of help and a lack of customers, they just close. And that's places like Black Point Inn, just outside Portland. They close at the end of October and will open again in May.
All right. Thanks again to Ted Fleischaker for joining me today. You've been listening to the Manifesto with Gideon, the Free-quent Flyer, on the Milenomics Podcast Network. Goodbye and good luck.